Warning, if you're one of the people who didn't like my Bright review for, certain reasons, you may want to skip ahead to this time code in the video. I'm gonna say this one time. I've seen a lot of videos reviewing this movie by, sardonic, pasty white boys dismissing the conscious decision by African-American audiences to treat this movie as an event of cultural significance or empowerment, and treating the whole thing as a misguided or idiotic media circus, or insinuating that it's not a legit means of supporting black creators somehow, or whatever, because it's just a big dumb action blockbuster, or it's just a Disney movie, etc., etc., etc. Listen, you all need to shut the f*** up. It is not your place to question what pieces of media are deemed culturally or racially significant by the black race, regardless of where it came from, and it's not your right to suggest that these people are being unreasonable or sad or stupid because you, someone with admittedly zero stake in the film's implicit meaning or even its genre, can't see the significance yourself. Yes, Marvel's Black Panther is important by sheer virtue of its existence. The extent of its importance is arguably debatable, but the fact that it is a significant event is not up for debate. It's an immutable fact, and it's largely because it's a giant superhero action flick distributed by the biggest entertainment corporation on the planet, not in spite of it. Get off your high horse, you're not better than anyone assigning political importance to this piece, and your attempt to shame people who can see that importance where you can't is not charming or smart. This movie means something to people, and it's not down to you to decide that it doesn't and that everyone else is just being ridiculous. Deal with it. So, before we get into just how the cultural and political aspects of Black Panther are handled in the film itself, let's talk about the movie on more broad terms for the time being. Taking place only a week after 2016's Captain America Civil War, this movie sees T'Challa returning home to be officially crowned King of Wakanda, the secretive African nation whose vast stores of the alien mineral vibranium allow them to thrive as the most advanced civilization on the planet, all while disguised as a broken third world country. The emergence of Ulysses Klaue, an outsider who caused the country quite a bit of grief years ago, sets off a series of events that has T'Challa questioning his perception of his kingship, his nation, and his deceased father. T'Challa himself is an interesting point of contention, since I've heard some reviews call him less interesting than the other characters surrounding him, or implying that he somehow gets lost in his own film. While he's definitely more of a low-key, stoic personality than, say, a Tony Stark or a Thor, there's never a moment in the movie where I personally feel like I've lost a hold on T'Challa as the center of the narrative. The thing is, the guy kind of had the character growth that you would have expected him to get in his first movie back in Civil War. And the fact that he's someone who's already squared his inner rage informs the central arc of this film so well. That's not to say he isn't a notably flawed person throughout the movie. He does grow and change over his journey, specifically in regards to losing his illusions about Wakanda. It's great and defined largely by his relationship with the film's villain, but we'll get to that later. That said, I can totally understand why he gets lost in the discussion of this movie's characters. With this film alone, the number of radical, complex female characters in this 10-year-old franchise was upped significantly. T'Challa's ex, Nakia, is saved from being just another kinda generic love interest elevated by a really good performance courtesy of Lupita Nyong'o, thanks to the fact that she herself also has a fully realized arc about where her allegiance lies and what the best place for her is, faced with Wakanda's refusal to get proactive about helping the outside world. Danai Gurira plays Okoye, the leader of Wakanda's all-female army, who also has her loyalties tested. Both women reflect T'Challa's struggles with tradition and whether it's even possible to remain part of the Wakandan system while still holding true to their ideals. In terms of lighter, less conflicted characters, we have T'Challa's kid sister Shuri, who does play into the themes of the film, but in a way you'd expect from someone who's too busy being a mouthy kid to worry about the big stuff. She's far more content being a genius and just plain awesome and or hilarious at pretty much every conceivable turn, which is fine by me. Also, hey, one of our heroes gets to have a living mother for once. In a Disney movie, am I right? As expected, being an older character, Angela Bassett doesn't do too much in terms of moving plot forward, but she and Forrest Whitaker are afforded a fair amount of pathos. Honestly, with how little he was featured in the advertisement, I was almost kind of worried that Marvel was going to squander Forrest goddamn Whitaker but trust me when I say that he gets one of the more emotionally resonant scenes in the movie. One of the bigger surprises in the film is actually the returning character of Martin Freeman as Everett Ross, mainly because coming out of Captain America Civil War I thought that he was going to be way more of an antagonistic presence, and he's honestly way more overtly sympathetic and heroic than I was expecting going into this film. He's an amicable presence and surprisingly makes a great double act with Shuri. I honestly could go on. This entire supporting cast is brilliant, but this video is likely going to be long enough as it is, and I trust that including some characters I haven't mentioned, anyone and everyone should come out of this movie with a favorite. Despite being set in an African nation, I openly read these movies' themes as obviously addressing and critiquing the nature of America. Not just in the sense that American racial politics directly inform the villain's outlook and backstory, but in the way that Wakanda is in ways that have been ironically pointed out by some of the film's detractors, analogous to America in 2018 as a political entity. This pertains to discussions about outreach, borders, but most especially whether loyalty to the country means serving it blindly or tearing down the seat of power when it starts to deviate from the country's own ideals. The movie doesn't really stop to sit down and speechify about these things for any great length of time. As usual, all the discussion feels natural. Though, as people have been quick to point out, unlike usual, there's no sense of the movie blunting the heavy topics of discussion with humor, an approach the other MCU movies take with some of the dark conversations that would have felt wildly inappropriate here, with a subject matter so specific and immediately harmful. I don't doubt for a second that a big part of what makes this movie more impactful than other MCU films for a lot of people is that, unlike, say, Iron Man 3's discussions about terrorism, or Age of Ultron's existential nihilism, none of the humor feels designed to make it so that the audience never gets too uncomfortable while we talk about a very uncomfortable subject. Black Panther never attempts to blunt its racial themes for the sake of making the film feel breezy and light, although I will admit breezy is kind of an applicable descriptor in a different way. Like all the MCU films before it, Black Panther runs at well over 2 hours, and yet it moves at such a clip it honestly felt like Marvel's shortest movie in the theater. It really flew by, though thankfully without feeling rushed. It's also surprisingly not a matter of leaning on action sequences to convey a lot of story points. Don't get me wrong, this is still very much an action movie, and when the action scenes occur they are always moving story forward, but none of the action ever feels indulgent. And you know what? The best thing about having so many likable and complex characters outside of the main hero who we know has to survive for the sequel is that there's more than one moment where I'm genuinely convinced that one of the characters could get axed, and at least a few moments where my breath caught because I wasn't immediately sure what happened to one of them. There's probably more "oh snap, are they okay?" moments in this film than I've gotten from any action movie in a while. It's also got one of the standout musical scores in the franchise, especially Killmonger's theme. Speaking of which, Michael B. Jordan as Eric Killmonger is quickly gaining headway as one of Marvel's best villains, if not the best. And while I'm gonna get tons of weird looks for admitting that yes, I still prefer Ultron, this guy is really impactful. He is a close second without a doubt. Better than Loki, better than Vulture, probably better than Netflix's Kingpin if I'm being honest. And if I'm being 100% real, Killmonger kinda reminds me of Ultron in a lot of ways. He's got a real casual, flighty air to him on the surface, throwing out condescending snark with a smile as a facade for very, very deep anger and bitterness. Like the Vulture in Spider-Man Homecoming, he's real human and relatable. Also, like Homecoming, I love that this movie ends with the sense that the hero is only able to be their best self by acknowledging the villain's point and adopting a more moderate version of their stance. Which brings us to Killmonger's point and the movie's stance on isolationism, which in order for me to speak on properly involves, I guess, what you might call thematic spoilers. If you want to save any in-depth discussion of the movie's themes for after you've seen it, skip ahead to this timecode and come back to this part once you've watched the film. I'll try my hardest to be vague about plot points and conclusions, but it would feel wrong to talk about this movie at all and not give my thoughts on its core ideas. Like any villain, Killmonger is an extremist and is ultimately quick to admit that he's operating from a desire for revenge for crimes committed against his race by colonizers, but on a deeper level, crimes committed against him personally by his own race. I've seen lots of people say Eric raises a great point about how his plans would basically serve as justice for years of wrongdoing, and very vocal members of my own viewing audience made clear that they agree with a lot of what he says, but I think the movie wisely doesn't treat him like anything other than a villain, albeit a very sympathetic and human one who, yes, does have a point to make. In keeping with my earlier statement about Wakanda as metaphor for America before it's analogous to any part of Africa, this movie, like any good superhero story, is about using your power to help. And Killmonger actively wants to hurt far more than he wants to help anyone, for deeply selfish reasons. Just think about how much of Eric's motivation and even his dialogue is punctuated by wanting things or taking things, because of his own sense of entitlement. Think about how many exchanges involve him going nah to whenever anyone says something he remotely disagrees with, cutting off any kind of actual discussion because, like Ultron or Kingpin or Ego or Loki or Ward, really most of the better MCU villains, Eric is kind of a petulant child deep down, contrasted with T'Challa, who's easily one of the most stable and adult protagonists that these movies have ever had. Not only that, but he does things once he does reach a position of power that make it clear that the guy isn't thinking about the future. Neither he or the characters who side with him are thinking about anything beyond his own gratification, and that in very real terms is the problem with a nominal desire for quote-unquote black supremacy. You can say it's about justice, but it's not. It's about you personally getting to feel good at the expense of other people. It's selfish. It's rooted in hatred and propagation of violence and tearing people down, not building people up. Killmonger exists as living proof of how that violence and corruption and exclusive attitude just escalates until it comes back to bite you in the ass. This is a superhero movie, so you can kind of assume how it ends, but regardless of who might be the victor in the surface conflict, there's no sense that the ideas Eric represents are defeated. Because they can't be defeated. There are no easy answers. The sad fact is that the discussion of whether or not a certain race deserves to have more power than any other, be that reasonable or not, is never going to go away, at least not in you or I's lifetime. This is a movie that readily admits that even though often two sides of a conflict are ultimately unreconcilable, there is nothing that any one side can do to make the other really go away. All you can do is adapt what you can into your philosophy and move forward with the intent to help the most and hurt the least that you possibly can. The MCU is great at, well, a lot of things, but one thing in particular is how they link all their movies and character journeys down to the most fundamental idea that makes a superhero. A hero does the right thing for the right reasons. A hero helps the most and hurts the least. Killmonger and the people who exist just like him of every race on the planet can't be heroes because their desire isn't actually to protect anything. Killmonger and those like him can talk all they want about making a nation great, or about how they're ultimately helping people long term. But when their methodology and their behavior is indicative of an inclination toward immaturity and violence, then there is no world in which they can ever truly be the correct party. Justice at the expense of innocent people regardless of their race or the faults of their ancestors is no justice at all. Okay, vague semi-spoilers out of the way, let's talk briefly about the other villain in the movie, because Andy Serkis as Ulysses Klaue is a laugh riot. He's one of those characters where his energy is infectious, and his very presence is enough to have one whooping or hollering through all of his scenes. I think Serkis might just be hyped over getting to play a substantial role without a big green body sock for once. He's the closest any comic book movie in 2 decades has gotten to the sheer over-the-top love of being evil that is Tommy Lee Jones in Batman Forever, and I mean that in all the best ways. That's a weird statement to make, but I love the idea that even in a movie like this one that wears all of its gravitas on its sleeve, this studio isn't afraid to have a complete cartoon character in the mix every once in a while. Really, it speaks once again to the downright artful ways in which the rest of the film is willing to take itself seriously that the complete and utter whack job with the robot hand never comes close to breaking that tone. Finally, I want to talk about the visual direction, because this is Ryan Coogler we're talking about, as in the Ryan Coogler whose direction alone was enough to have me bawling like a little baby throughout the last 30 minutes of Creed, twice, and man does he bring it to this movie. Easily one of the MCU's best-looking films, if not the best-looking one. I adore the use of color, the action scenes are deliberately shot and staged with incredible fluidity, and man, there's some scenes in a kind of astral plane or afterlife that are some of the best-looking stuff in this franchise. And not even in a big show-off, look at how cool I am kind of way. Coogler's biggest strength is in not making it so any of his visuals look or feel like they're hyping themselves up or are forced narratively. My favorite single shot in the whole film is literally just a change of background coloring, and it's because of narrative placement giving that one simple image as much impact as possible. Much like Taika Waititi in Thor Ragnarok, it's clear that Marvel really let Coogler execute an uncompromised vision, and darned if the guy isn't a visionary. And so this has all been a love fest. Do I have any relatively minor complaints about this movie? Sure. For as much gushing as I can do about the visuals on many levels, the CGI in the final action scene might be some of the worst any of these movies have had in a long time. One of the major supporting characters kinda exits the movie without any real sense of closure at all, which is maybe the only thing that stops this film from functioning 100% as a complete self-contained piece, in a manner similar to Thor Ragnarok. And lastly, while this isn't actually a negative at all in the context of this movie because it's handled brilliantly, this really is the last time that one of these movies is going to be able to pull off effectively hiding a huge twist and/or plot point in a seemingly relatively innocuous prologue. This makes the fourth film in just a couple of years to pull that trick after Civil War, Guardians 2, and Homecoming. But really, that's all small peanuts. As exactly the kind of guy who readily calls some of Marvel's output downright masterpieces, I definitely count this movie among them, even though I'm not someone who would call it my favorite. I place it above the likes of Homecoming, Doctor Strange, and Iron Man 3, which means a lot coming from me, but where it falls next to Guardians 2 or any of the Avengers movies is, let's call it TBD. I should have seen it a second time between writing and uploading this video, so a more solid sense of placement relative to other films should come soon enough. Stay tuned for a spoiler cast that I'm going to be doing with my friends in the coming weeks for more concrete thoughts on the film in that regard. I would say go watch it, but let's face it, odds are you already have. But what do you think? Leave your thoughts down below nicely, and I'll be sure to respond with something not too snarky, probably.